Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Will Donald Trump end tax on tips? Will he go all the way and end tax on everything? During the campaign, our 47th president made a big, beautiful series of promises about things he would exempt from the tyrannical income tax that preys upon our fair republic. He started with no tax on tips in June, inspired by a, quote, very smart waitress he met dining in Las Vegas, and subsequently introduced as the No Tax on Tips Act by Senator Ted Cruz. Happily, what happened in Vegas did not stay in Vegas, as Trump embarked upon a cascade of income tax exemptions from overtime pay to Social Security, then first responders, and even America's 16 to 18 million veterans. Capping it all off with Trump musing on the Joe Rogan show that we should just get rid of the whole stinking income tax so the federal government lives off tariffs. Now, I mentioned in previous videos how this would nearly double take-home pay and shrink the federal government 2-for-1. Alas, politics is the art of the possible, so will any of it actually happen? So the starting point is Trump's clearest promise, no tax on tips. This is massively popular. Ipsos says 3/4 of Americans support it, even among Democrats. In fact, there's almost no difference in support between Republicans and Democrats. That makes it the perfect gateway drug. Now, right now, betting market Kalshi puts 63% odds of no tax on tips in the next 2 years. Polymarkets puts it at 40% odds by April. Now, no tax on tips is obviously great for the 4 million tipped workers who on average make just $17.56 an hour with tips. They would take home another $7,000 a year between income and payroll taxes. That's a 30% raise. This would, of course, increase the deficit by about $10 billion per year, according to the Tax Foundation, which is allegedly anti-tax, but apparently spends its time attacking tax cuts. Considering $10 billion is roughly 1/17th what we gave Ukraine, many Americans might feel blue-collar workers keeping their money is a better use of money than Ukraine's meat grinder. The other criticism is that it's distortionary because it exempts tips but still taxes hourly pay. Tax Foundation conjures a dystopia where, quote, accountants receive their income as voluntary tips. In other words, if you don't like your accountant or your cable provider, you don't have to pay. Which sounds pretty awesome. Moreover, as Ronald Reagan put it, quote, like my grandchildren, I love all tax cuts. Because they drain the federal beast, they encourage work and entrepreneurship, and of course they return stolen goods. And if that taxless dystopia comes, when prices are replaced by tips, sign me up. So what's next? No tax on tips is great for blue-collar workers, but it's great for everybody because it suggests that broader tax cuts are also coming, perhaps with 40% odds by April. Why? Because tax cuts are very easy to attack as handouts to the rich, since they're overwhelmingly paid by middle and upper earners. Today, the bottom half of earners pay precisely 2.3% of income taxes. So you'd obviously pair a blue-collar tax cut like no tax on tips with across-the-board cuts. That means those across-the-board cuts could also be coming as soon as April. That raises the odds, dare we dream, that Donald Trump can pull a rabbit out of his hat and we skip the Biden recession altogether. The American people spend over $500 billion per year defending themselves against the IRS. That's spitting distance from the $800 billion the Department of Defense spends protecting us against foreigners, well, failing to protect us in the case of the border. So forget Ukraine, forget ISIS. The calls are coming from inside the House. The number comes from my based colleague Richard Stern, who reports on a new Tax Foundation study that the income tax costs Americans $546 billion per year in compliance alone, compared to our national defense budget at $849, which is supposed to protect the American people, yet completely fails to protect us from the IRS. Note this, $546 billion is on top of the $4.9 trillion they actually took from us in taxes, and of course it is separate from the economic impact of taxes, which might add another $15 trillion in lost income. Breaking it down, the 546 is made up of 7.9 billion hours Americans spend complying with the tax code, which at 10 million words is the length of 21 Lord of the Rings trilogies, all made of pure legalese.
Of course, nobody actually understands the tax code. That's why big corporations hire tax lawyers at $500 an hour. But regular Americans, many of whom cannot name a state thanks to government schools, are assumed to have completely mastered the entire 10 million words of legalese, or they will throw you in a cage. That's equivalent to nearly 4 million Americans working full-time and without pay, doing nothing but tax paperwork. That's the population of Los Angeles. It's also 46 times the workforce of the IRS, meaning for every tax bureaucrat we pay to steal from us, another 46 Americans have to spend their evenings and weekends helping the IRS steal instead of playing with their kids. On top of the hours, Americans spend another $133 billion a year out of pocket on things like tax software, so that's about $1,000 per year per household. So you could have bought groceries, instead you bought TurboTax. Note, 546 doesn't begin to estimate the cost of the IRS. I mentioned in previous videos studies estimating that we lose $3 in production for every dollar taken in taxes, since taxes discourage production. So why work, why build or expand a business if the government is just going to take it? That suggests the $4.9 trillion in taxes the IRS actually does take are costing us roughly $15 trillion in lost output. So 546 in compliance, 4.9 in lost taxes, 15 trillion in lost output. Rarely have so few taken so much from so many. For perspective, that comes to roughly 8 times what Americans spend on housing. It's 10 times what we spend on food, all for the IRS. So what's next? A constant theme in our administrative state is spending trillions protecting us from threats that are not real. Ukraine, climate, transphobia, while it ignores the threats that are very real, from inflation to street crime to predatory taxation that forces us to run on a treadmill until we are 70. Between Trump's promised tax cuts, Elon's spending cuts, and slashing the administrative state that strangles the economy, we can see light at the end of the tunnel, but there's a lot of special interests, from uniparty politicians to millions of parasitic bureaucrats who desperately want to keep it going. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. The holidays are coming and it's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. An IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. And with Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans. It's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/Bitcoin-IRA. If you own gold, you've probably been very happy with prices hitting all-time highs. But your gold can do more than just go up. It can generate passive income for you. With monetary metals, you can earn up to 5% interest on your gold and silver, paid in more ounces. Credit investors can even achieve double-digit returns in their bond offerings. All interest is paid in ounces of gold and silver stored in your account free of charge. If your metal is gathering dust at home or costing storage fees in a vault, it's time to start putting your metal to work with Monetary Metals. Visit monetary-metals.com/Peter today to learn more. Now back to our show. Javier Milei is making Argentina great again. Despite the best efforts of the socialism industrial complex, he vowed to carefully disassemble with a chainsaw. In just 11 months in office, Milei cut spending by a third. That's $2 trillion, actually $2.3 trillion in U.S. terms. He got rid of 70,000 government workers, which is 700,000 in U.S. terms. Afuera they went. That brought monthly inflation from 13% when Milei took office, 420% annualized, to just 2.7%. Argentina's risk premium, the penalty investors put on national debt, exited distressed territory, plunging from 25% to just 8%. Argentina stocks are up 125% on the year, bonds are up 85%, all in just 11 months. Amazing what happens when you tear out socialism root and branch with a chainsaw. Of course, cutting government spending by nearly 6% of GDP is going to cause a short-term recession, since there's less raiding of the treasury going on. But still, it was less than feared. Current estimates are about 3.5% contraction in GDP for 2024. Still, left-wing local media have seized on it, joined by CNN, Bloomberg, and New York Times, who want Milei to fail, lest he inspire Americans who would also like to cut inflation and government, which would cut off the socialism industrial complex to which our legacy media sold its ideological soul. The cheap shots have not worked. The AP recently lamented how Milei's popularity is, quote, gravity-defying, despite legions of unemployed bureaucrats, who incidentally marched in the street violently. Moreover, the left's austerity gaslight is collapsing because having cut the fat, Milei's economy is now taking off. Just last week, J.P. Morgan revised Argentina's GDP growth for next year to 8.5%, which is one of the highest in the world. Investment is up, spending is up, jobs are up, even government workers are finding something that's actually useful to do in life. So what's next? The first task for Milei was always stabilize the economy to keep public support amid the spending cuts. The trick is let the medicine work, keep the reforms going until the economy sprouts enough jobs and income to make up for the cuts. Milei stuck with it. The next steps are to consolidate the gains in inflation and growth while moving on to structural reforms. So Milei has promised 4,000 reforms that are ready to go. These include cutting red tape and taxes to ramp up business investment, especially small business, privatizing crony government firms that freeze great hunks of the Argentinian economy in carbonite, replacing government schools with vouchers to cut the left's Marxism factory off at the source, and crime, where Milei is exploring El Salvador's wildly successful crime-fighting strategy of actually putting criminals in prison. His Minister of Interior, Homeland Security in U.S. terms, is already working to adapt Bukele's tough-on-crime approach to Argentina. Finally, the promise that was central to Milei's campaign, eliminating the central bank altogether. End the Fed Argentina style. During his campaign, Milei called the central bank, quote, a scam, a mechanism to cheat people through inflation. This would make Argentina one of only 8 countries that do not have a central bank, and given the Argentinian central bank has authored no less than 5 hyperinflations since 1975, closing the central bank alone would cement Javier Milei's legacy. As with Donald Trump, if Milei can keep the Argentinian people on his side, he can remake his country and rescue it from the long night of Marxism. Milei's success is an inspiration to our own Department of Government Efficiency that promises to also cut inflation, cut government waste, and put the American economy on the tip of a rocket. The Pentagon has failed its 7th audit in a row, losing track of $2.5 trillion worth of assets. Where will Elon possibly find $2 trillion of waste and fraud? Last week, the Pentagon once again failed its legally mandated annual audit, suggesting that government workers are, in fact, above the law. Now they're promising to get their books sorted by 2028, which just so happens to be when Trump leaves office. In fact, the Pentagon has never passed an audit dating back to 1990 when they were mandated by the Chief Financial Officers Act. That act gave them until 2017, so 27 years to comply, since military-industrial lobbyists have a lot of friends in Congress. Nonetheless, here we are 34 years later, and 7 years after it became legally binding, and the Pentagon still can't account for $2.5 trillion. Was it sold on eBay? Was it purloined by contractors? Is it in a slush fund for regime change and election fortification? Who knows? The DoD chief financial officer was defiant, saying, quote, if a report card is half good and half bad, you wouldn't call that a failure. After all, they do know where some of the assets are. For example, the Pentagon building, which is marked on a map and almost impossible to give to the Taliban. It's worth noting that if your taxes are only 37% accurate, you will not get a pass to fix it in 2028. You will be in a cage. It's also worth noting that Enron executives did 20 years for misstating assets. WorldCom got 25. So how does the Pentagon manage to lose track of so much money? Alas, we only have glimpses since they can't pass an audit. But what we can see is hilarious. For example, an estimated $220 billion in untracked spare parts, which are literally sold on eBay, presumably for export. To give a flavor, one warehouse allegedly contained $127 million in spare parts, and it was not even listed on their property records. They didn't know it existed. Now, given nobody's watching the till, this all means military contracts can be fantastically profitable. DoD famously paid $640 for toilet seat covers. Inflation adjusted, that's $1,600. In 2018, they paid $10,000 for a toilet seat cover for C-17 cargo planes. After a public outcry, they just 3D printed it for $300. Beyond premium toilet seat covers, the Pentagon's Inspector General found they overpaid 4,450% for airplane parts, which they probably lost, including a washer, like a middle ring for a screw, that cost $4,000. Zoom out to entire programs, and it is grim. The new F-35 fighter, which is obsolete given drones, was promised at $50 million a pop, but has now climbed to nearly $700 million per plane. For perspective, $700 million would replace roughly 500 railroad bridges. It would pave 10,000 miles of rural roads, or it would keep a military contractor in mistresses, in case you wonder why the wars must go on. So what's next? In a 2014 Gallup poll, Americans estimated that 51 cents of every federal dollar went to waste and fraud, with state governments close behind at 47 cents. If that's true, we are wasting more than $5 trillion per year fattening federal leeches, more than twice the entire income tax. The solution is very easy. Slash the spending, fire the leeches, repeal the income tax. All it takes is translating public opinion into public policy. A word from our sponsor. If you run a business and you're looking to get customers excited about your loyalty and reward program, you can now implement Bitcoin rewards with Oshi Loyalty. You get all the perks of a full-featured loyalty and rewards program with real Bitcoin rewards every time your customers shop, refer, and engage. Boost customer retention, loyalty, and lifetime value. And if you're looking for Bitcoin rewards when you shop, check out the dozens of companies at the Oshi Marketplace at oshi.tech/shop. Start earning Bitcoin today. Now back to our show. The left-wing media is collapsing, and it is spectacular. Notorious conspiracy theorist CNN is set for, quote, hundreds of layoffs, including on-screen talent. Associated Press is laying off 8% of its global workforce. Rumors are floating that MSNBC could even be sold for parts as ratings plunge 50% since the election. So why is left-wing media collapsing? Easy. The audience does not trust them. We just came off the mother of gaslights trying to convince the American people that Kamala is joyful and competent, while Donald Trump will literally dictate your uterus. Americans are not buying it. Gallup reports that American trust in media has fallen just 31%. As recently as 2004, most Americans did trust the media. In the 1970s, 3/4 trusted the media. This matters because for decades, media controlled the narrative. The gaslight industrial complex has so terrified conservatives that whatever backbone they once had is long gone. From government shutdowns to spending cuts to welfare for the able-bodied to immigration amnesty, the GOP would campaign right, then flip left, or kiss their jobs goodbye from a vengeful media. So those days are over. And how did we get here? In the beginning of our republic, newspapers were party organs, essentially political ads. By 1900, they grew into an oligarchy of three men: Joseph Pulitzer, left-wing Democrat; Randolph Hearst, who started left but turned conservative; and Frank Gannett, a conservative. As their power grew, the government started censoring the news, with Woodrow Wilson using World War I as the excuse. He threatened Hearst with the Espionage Act and Sedition Act and intercepted conservative newspapers using the post office. In the 1930s, FDR did it again, censoring anti-New Deal newspapers before the war, then using radio and TV licenses to blackmail opponents. There was literally an office of censorship. After the war, this was codified by the FCC into the so-called Fairness Doctrine that allegedly balanced coverage, but in reality amounted to a political commissar. Out of self-preservation, broadcasters took the pro-government position, meaning the Democrat position. A seminal moment was the conservative New York Times raiding the newsroom of the Communist Village Voice in the 1960s. So by the end of the 60s, the media was a near left-wing monoculture, with Walter Cronkite and then Dan Rather the tip of the spear. And then the tide turned. The first wave was Ronald Reagan, who ended the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. Within a year, a small-time DJ in Kansas City decided to start talking about politics. Hundreds more followed, Rush Limbaugh into the breach. From talk radio, alternative media graduated to the internet starting in 1994. And then social media, which started in 2004 with Facebook and 2006 with Twitter. They were originally censorship-free, meaning they favored the conservative media. Of course, the empire struck back, purging conservatives starting in 2014, so mid-Obama, and ramping it up under Trump since the establishment panicked that they were losing control. That censorship, of course, was single-handedly reversed by Elon Musk, bringing us to today, where alt-media from Twitter, now X, to Tucker and Joe Rogan, two citizen journalists on the ground in North Carolina, or in the bars with Veritas, are wiping out legacy media. So what's next? Media has been called the fourth branch of government. In many ways, it's the most powerful because it shapes the voters. The collapse of left-wing media means we are about to get a tectonic shift in America, in fact, in global politics, towards more populism, more conservatism, and a smaller and more responsive government. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.